I'm going to be drawing a connection from early noosphere thought, the way that Pierre, Teilhard de Chardin and Vladimir Vernadsky elaborated the noosphere in the 20s, 30s, and 40s. And then I'm going to suggest some of the narratives that surrounded that early concept of the noosphere, and then ask to what extent we might need to shift those narratives, think about those narratives in the context of the 21st century. So I actually wanted to start with the word itself very quickly with the etymology. As many of you know, of course, that Nous is an ancient Greek word for mind, but it wasn't a neutral concept for the ancient Greeks. It carried a connotation of a unifying and elevating form of thought. And at the same time, sphere, the other half of the word, on the one hand, it's part of the scientific terminology for planetary envelopes, but at the same time, it was far from neutral for the Greeks as well. And going back to Empedocles, it implied a kind of a perfect shape of inclusion, a moment when the force of love was at its zenith in the universe. Empedocles said that everything took the shape of a sphere. And this etymology was very much, I think, at play in Teilhard de Chardin and Vladimir Vernadsky's thinking as they coined the concept in the 20s. One way we can describe them both, I think, is scientist mystics, and in both these domains, they've provided us with massive contributions and provocations. The one thing that they did less of is they weren't as politically oriented in terms of the way that they thought, and reading Teilhard and Vernadsky, when reading about some of their reflections on the politics of their times, that I think is one of the places where in a certain sense, the 21st century it may not be as much of a match for some of the dimensions of their approach. But to start with really the kind of political moment that they lived through, they were really kind of coming up with the idea in response to the world wars, and especially in response to the experience of the First World War. Teilhard de Chardin saw this war up close. He was a heroic stretcher bearer on the front lines, and Vladimir Vernadsky was actually assigned by imperialist Russia to help in a commission that gathered all of the knowledge about geological resources in order to then think about what could be brought into war production. So they both were deeply impacted by the world wars, and they saw a lot of the suffering, and a lot of their scientific and mystical thought was formed in response to these immense conflicts. And one might think that being exposed to world wars would pose a challenge to a faith in technology and in mass communication, especially World War II, and as well with the notion of progress with a capital P. And they grappled with this, certainly. But if we read their writings, they end up producing and providing a very hopeful vision of the future. And this isn't. I'm not trying to. I don't want to say that this is a bad thing. I think what we might want to start teasing apart though here is that the noosphere, as they understood it, was three things. I think one, it was a scientific concept, a theory about planetary envelopes. Two was an expression of hope in the future in truly dark times. And three, it was I think in some sense also a defense mechanism in the way that it was formulated against the kind of a global trauma that they and so many others had suffered in the first half of the 20th century. And what I want to suggest, and this actually connects to Raphael's opening remarks, is that the strong metaphysical idea of the noosphere as a narrative that is leading towards a new planetary envelope of mind that is harmonious and that embraces all of humanity, that there's an element of that narrative that I think we should approach with some caution. And I want to connect this to the political here. So one point to make before I move into the geopolitical dimension of the talk is that our 21st century trauma is not exactly the same as Teilhard and Vernadsky's trauma. So one of the key differences is that, of course, their predictions ended up being almost more right than they knew. So when Vernadsky was talking about our planetary technologies expressing themselves as a force in the Earth system, that has indeed happened, but it's a very ambivalent result. You know, we all know the familiar list of climate change, mass extinctions, the Anthropocene. We also all know, you know, all of the interconnections and transportation networks that have also been forged. So it's not that it's a negative list, but it's that the vision that noosphere will be immediately harmonious in the way that, or will maybe not immediately harmonious, but is tending towards harmony in the way that Vernadsky and Teilhard mostly wrote about it, is complicated a little bit by the reality of the planetary technologies of impact that we have. And we could say something similar for the planetary technologies of information and communication. These two are now fraught. And you know, on the one hand, we are indeed more interconnected than ever. And Teilhard, I think, in some ways, his prescience is, we can recognize it when we think about our internet. At the same time, you know, we confront media bubbles, disinformation, polarized societies, everything that Human Energy has so usefully condensed into the description of the techno-social dilemma. So in that sense, they were right, but the structure of experience that the world that they predicted has taken on is a far more ambivalent one than a strong, maybe metaphysical narrative might suggest. So it can't exactly be our hope or defense in the same way as it was for them. I mean, we're living in a different moment. And the other dimension of this, where our moment and really the decades after Vernadsky and Teilhard were writing, faces a distinct challenge, is in how to envision the planetary political community. And what I want to do here is connect the narratives around the early noosphere to the kinds of narratives that emerged after World War II to think about divisions in the planetary political community that were beyond the national, beyond the divisions between nation states. These attempts, and this is ultimately, of course, going to lead back to the provocation of this conference, the pairing of noosphere and the global south, the incredibly productive, I think, suggestion. So I'll lead us through some of the narratives that are associated with developing and developed worlds, with the third, second, and first worlds, with that framework, and then with the global south and global north, and track what is happening to the narrative dimension here. And let's see, I'll switch slides, here we go. So developing and developed world, as many people, or likely everybody knows, that it emerges really in this 40s to 60s period and then becomes entrenched among many intergovernmental agencies. Social scientists, becomes part of modernization and development theory. And when we analyze the implied narrative structure of the developing and developed world, we end up with really a single line of history with the proposition of a future that's shared among all political communities, and certain political communities are at different positions on this line relative to others. So you end up with a very kind of a direct and simplified narrative and way of understanding the relationship between different political communities. And I think in a certain sense, this implied narrative recalls the dominant strands of Teilhard and Vernadsky's visions of a harmonious noosphere, in the sense that if you have a perspective on the unfolding of the planet and its layers, and that unfolding is going to lead to one shared destination, one shared sphere of mind. And at the same time, in developing and developed, we see a narrative structure that has that same shape, that we have a shared future and a teleological line leading to that future. And this, of course, has been critiqued significantly, and I just what I want to do here is point out the narrative structures for you guys, and then something interesting happens when you set the developing and developed world framework in conversation with the three worlds framework, with the first, second, third world framework, and this was first proposed by the French demographer Alfred Sauvy, and in the early 50s. And what's interesting about going back to that initial text where it was first proposed is there's some kind of hints of complexity in that text beyond what the framework then became when it was actually adopted by, again, various social scientists and governmental bodies. So one thing that's introduced, of course, is the notion of conflict. So you no longer have a single future towards which history is tending, as you do implied in the developing and developed world. Rather, you suddenly have a bifurcated future proposed with two different types of communities. I mean, various ways of defining them, whether one talks about them as Western capitalist democracies, as the Soviet bloc. But you have these two different visions of the future. This, again, I'm only kind of trying to describe what's baked into this vision. And then you have a domain that is, again, kind of like developing and developed, positioned at a different point in history and then deciding which of these paths to go. But if we read the original article, you actually have a sense that as the developing and developed world narrative started being broken down and bifurcated, you have a little bit more of an opening of possible narrative directions for history. So V writes that you have two avant-garde, the Western and the Eastern, that have separated themselves from the present majority by a few centuries. Should we follow one of them or try another route? And I want to put emphasis on that last line of that rhetorical question. He's, of course, trying to put himself in the position of his kind of his self-styled description of the third world, and is again suggesting this line of history, the split line of history now, but then suggesting that there are other routes, that these may not be the only two. And so all sorts of problematic assumptions in the three worlds framework, all sorts of problematic assumptions in the developing and developed framework. But what I want to highlight between these two is that a single narrative structure of all of history tending to one place is starting to break down in Sauvy. And that brings us to the conjunction of our conference today of the Noosphere and the Global South. And in a certain sense, I think one of the ways that at least I've understood the importance of the typology of Global South and Global North against the earlier attempts at pointing to differences and divisions in the human planetary political community is that the Global South and the Global North steps away from narrative even more than the three worlds, and the three worlds we saw had a slightly weaker teleology than the teleological narrative of the developing and developed world. So the Global South and Global North amounts to one of the contributions is to say that before we try to fit a narrative of history, which of course always opens up the question of who's telling that narrative, who is seeing themselves as at what position in that narrative, who has voice. The Global South suggests first, and Global North framework, an attention to difference, inequities, and divisions before a commitment to narrative structure. And I think that is actually something that as we try to think about the early noosphere with its dominant narrative structure in Teilhard and Vernadsky, and think about the 21st century and how we think about the political dimension of human planetarity, I think here we can learn an important lesson for the noosphere from the framework of the Global South and Global North. 4 minutes? Yeah, I think we're good. So what does this mean then for the noosphere? Well, I mean, I think as I just outlined, it means that maybe when we retrieve the powerful resources of that concept from the 20s. The ideas that we can take both kind of inspirational and reconceptualizing the planetary system and thinking on that planetary level. One thing that we might want to approach with more caution is the overarching narrative structure that Teilhard and Vernadsky tended to attribute to the noosphere and to the unfolding of the noosphere. And again, like maybe we approach the strong metaphysics with more caution in order to open up a plurality of futures. To go with, again, Raphael, the point on the S of transitions here. So I'll close with just giving 3 examples of starting to rethink, at least for me, the noosphere and the political in the 21st century. And I'll take 2 from the second half of the 20th century and then 1 from the 21st. Many of you will be familiar with Hannah Arendt's work and her attempts in The Human Condition to outline what the active life of a human being is, laying out her typology of labor, work, and political action. And in many ways, she was the philosopher who always insisted on the importance of the political and the importance of not losing oneself sheerly in the world of thought. But then towards the second half of her life and in her later work, she turned back to the vita contemplativa, the life of thought, and became very concerned with how to connect how one thinks with how one acts. And again, we're talking on this like higher metapolitical level. And so I think that is already a resource for starting to kind of think about the noosphere and think about the role of thought in political activity. That's one example. The second is a more direct historical political instance that is rarely discussed, but is fascinating, I think, and that's Mikhail Gorbachev towards the end of the Soviet Union when he was instituting reforms. He consistently described Vernadsky, who had passed away 50 years before Gorbachev came to power. He consistently described attempted reforms like perestroika, like glasnost, and then even kind of how Gorbachev conceptualized his role in relationship to a collapsing empire through Vernadsky and the concept of the noosphere. So it's an interesting example where the noosphere seemingly, I mean, Gorbachev's legacy is complex, of course, but the noosphere seemingly played a role in a world leader thinking about how to essentially step away from power and thinking about how to shift the narrative of his own, quote unquote, imperial structure, shift that narrative away from seeing the Soviet Union as at the forefront of history. And then the third example is 2 scholars who are familiar to human energy folks, is David Ronfeld and John Arquilla recently have started theorizing that as the noosphere develops, it's going to become not necessarily a harmonious layer in and of itself, but rather that layer of thought is going to bring in a different form of politics, a form of politics where narrative and information become the objects of contestation, become things that we have to navigate. And so there too, they're stepping away from a vision of the noosphere that almost moves quickly to the resolution of the very challenges that it might pose, and opening up to kind of higher level political theory, and even in their theory, in their thinking, the shift from realpolitik to noopolitik. So that is really kind of what I want to leave us with here, is the prompt to think about what the role of narrative was in early noosphere thought, what the role of narrative should be in the 21st century, and how all of this kind of connects to these higher level geopolitical and metapolitical questions. Thank you.